The Observer. Commander Vex Lar stood at the observation deck of the flagship Dominant Force, his forearms crossed behind his back as he stared at the display showing the small Earth transport vessel approaching their fleet. He flicked his secondary eyelids in annoyance, mandibles clicking together in a rhythm that signaled his growing impatience to his subordinates. Remind me again why we're allowing this human on board during our negotiations with the Salarian Union, he asked, not bothering to look at his second-in-command. Lieutenant Craw cleared her throat, the sound coming out like grinding stones. The Galactic Council insisted on it, Commander. Apparently, humans are a protected species under the Sentient Development Act. Since we're discussing territorial disputes that border their solar system, they're entitled to send an observer. An observer? Vexlar's voice dripped with sarcasm. Because clearly we need a barely space-capable species watching over our shoulder while we negotiate with an actual power in this sector. The communications officer, a younger Krellel named Taz Vek, swiveled in her chair. Commander, the human transport is requesting permission to dock. They're carrying only one passenger as agreed upon. Oh joy, just one primitive to babysit instead of a whole delegation. Vexlar waved a dismissive hand. Grant them permission, but have security teams standing by and make sure our guest understands they are here to observe, not participate. Yes, Commander, Tazvek turned back to her console, relaying the instructions. Vexlar turned to look out the viewport, watching as the tiny human vessel approached their massive warship. The Dominant Force was the pride of the Krell hegemony's fleet, nearly 2 km long, bristling with plasma cannons and gravitational disruptors. Compared to it, the human ship looked like a child's toy. Such a waste of resources, he muttered. The negotiations with the Salarian Union will likely end in war anyway. These humans should be grateful we're honoring their protected status at all. Lieutenant Cross shifted uncomfortably. The Salarians have been amassing forces at the border, Commander. Our intelligence suggests they've developed new weaponry. Let them come, Vexlar's mandibles stretched into what passed for a smile among his species. The hegemony has never lost a war, and we won't start now. The docking bay hummed with the sound of magnetic clamps engaging as the human vessel secured itself to the Dominant Force. The squad of Krellel security personnel stood at attention, their chitinous armor gleaming under the harsh lights. The airlock cycled open with a hiss, and a single human stepped out onto the deck. Vexlar, who had come down to greet the visitor personally, a diplomatic courtesy he found tedious, was surprised by the human's appearance. She was small, all humans were compared to the average Krellel with dark skin and curly hair pulled back tightly. But it was her eyes that caught Vexlar's attention. They were alert, calculating, missing nothing as they swept across the docking bay. Commander Vexlar, I presume. The human's voice was clear and confident. She executed a perfect Krellel greeting gesture, touching her forehead and then extending her palm outward. I am Zara Parker, diplomatic observer from Earth. Vexlar returned the gesture, impressed despite himself at the human's knowledge of Krellel customs. Welcome aboard the Dominant Force, Observer Parker. I trust your journey was adequate. Quite pleasant, thank you, she smiled, showing her flat herbivore teeth. I appreciate the hegemony honoring the Council's request for Earth representation. As if we had a choice, Vexlar muttered, then raised his voice. Of course, the hegemony respects Council mandates even when they seem unnecessary. If the human took offense, she didn't show it. I understand negotiations with the Salarian Union begin in 3 hours. I'd like to freshen up before then if possible. Vexlar gestured to a security officer. Officer Track will escort you to your quarters. They've been adapted for human environmental needs. He leaned closer, towering over the small human. Remember, Observer Parker, you are here to watch and listen, nothing more. Parker nodded, her face a mask of professional courtesy. Of course, Commander. I'm simply here to ensure Earth's interests are represented through observation of the proceedings. As the human walked away, escorted by Officer Track, Lieutenant Craw stepped up beside Vexlar. She seems competent, Craw observed, for a primitive. Yes, Vexlar's mandibles clicked in amusement. But it makes no difference. The Salarians will push too far, as they always do, and when they do, we'll crush them. The human can observe that too. The negotiations were proceeding exactly as Vexlar had predicted. The Salarian delegation, led by High Counselor Reth, was being obstinate about mineral rights in the Kuiper sector. Those asteroid fields have been neutral territory for centuries, Reth argued, his bioluminescent skin flashing in patterns of frustration. The hegemony has no right to claim them unilaterally. Vexlar leaned forward, 6 fingers steepled. The hegemony has invested considerable resources in mapping and surveying those fields. By galactic law, that gives us priority claim. Mapping isn't development, Reth countered. You haven't established mining operations or permanent facilities. We were about to before your patrol ships began interfering with our survey vessels. The human observer, Parker, sat silently at the side of the room, taking notes on a small electronic device. Vexlar had almost forgotten she was there until he noticed how intently she was watching the exchange. The negotiations dragged on for hours with neither side willing to give ground. Eventually, Vexlar called for a recess. We will reconvene in 2 hours, he announced. Perhaps the Salarian delegation will have come to their senses by then. As the delegates filed out, Vexlar noticed Parker approaching High Counselor Reth. The human and Salarian exchanged a few words, too quiet for him to hear. Reth's skin flashed briefly in what Vexlar recognized as surprise before the Salarian nodded and continued on his way. Vexlar narrowed his eyes. The human was supposed to be a passive observer, not engaging with the Salarians directly. He made a mental note to watch her more closely. What were you discussing with Counselor Reth? Vexlar demanded, cornering Parker in the corridor outside the conference room. The human looked up at him, unfazed by his intimidating posture. Mia Kalman, I was asking about Salarian cultural protocols. I've had limited exposure to your species and I want to avoid any unintentional offense. You're not here to interact, you're here to observe, Vexlar reminded her. With respect, Commander, observation includes understanding the cultural context of the negotiations. Wouldn't you agree? Vexlar's mandibles clicked in irritation. Just remember your place, human. These negotiations are delicate. The last thing we need is a primitive species blundering into interstellar politics. Parker smiled politely. I assure you, Commander, I have no intention of blundering anywhere. May I return to my quarters to prepare for the next session? Vexlar waved her away, watching her retreating form with suspicion. Something about this human didn't sit right with him. She was too composed, too confident, not at all what he expected from a species that had only achieved interplanetary travel within the last century. When negotiations resumed, Vexlar was surprised to find the Salarian delegation seemingly more conciliatory. We've reconsidered our position, Counselor Reth announced. We're willing to acknowledge Krellel priority claims to the eastern quadrant of the asteroid fields in exchange for shared access to the western quadrant. Vexlar blinked, suspicious of the sudden change. That's a reasonable proposal, but what about the central quadrant? That's where our surveys indicate the highest concentration of rare minerals. We propose joint development of the central quadrant, Reth said. Equal investment, equal profit sharing. Before Vexlar could respond, an urgent message came through on his personal communicator. He excused himself and stepped away from the table. What is it, Lieutenant? He growled into the device. Kraw's voice was tense. Commander, we've detected unusual activity from the human's quarters. She's been accessing our ship's information network. Accessing what kind of information? That's just it, sir. She's not looking at classified data or weapon systems. She's been reviewing historical records of Krell-Salarian conflicts, trade disputes, and cultural documents. Vexlar's eyes narrowed. Keep monitoring her. I want to know every file she accesses. He returned to the negotiation table, casting a suspicious glance at Parker, who sat innocently taking notes. Was this human up to something? And if so, what could one primitive possibly hope to accomplish on a Krellel warship? As the day progressed, negotiations moved from territorial disputes to trade agreements. Throughout it all, the human observer remained silent, occasionally taking notes but otherwise being the model of discretion. During another recess, Vexlar summoned Parker to his private office. Observer Parker, he began, looming over her as she stood before his desk. I'm curious, what do you think of our negotiations so far? Parker looked surprised at being asked her opinion. It's not my place to offer opinions, Commander. I'm here to observe. Humor me, Vexlar insisted. After all, these negotiations could impact your solar system eventually. Parker considered for a moment. Well, if you're asking unofficially, I find it interesting that both sides seem to be approaching this as a zero-sum game. Explain. In Earth's history, the most successful long-term agreements were those where both parties felt they gained something valuable. Right now, it seems like both the hegemony and the Union are focused on what they might lose rather than what they might gain through cooperation. Vexlar clicked his mandibles in amusement. A charmingly naive perspective. Interstellar politics isn't about cooperation, human, it's about power. The Salarians understand this as well as we do. Perhaps, Parker acknowledged with a slight nod. But even predators sometimes find it beneficial to cooperate rather than compete. Vexlar found himself intrigued by the human's reasoning. And what would you suggest if you were more than an observer? Parker smiled. I'd suggest looking for complementary strengths. For instance, the Krellal hegemony excels at resource extraction and processing, while the Salarian Union has superior distribution networks. A partnership that leverages both could increase profits for everyone involved. Interesting theory, Vexlar conceded. But the Salarians have been our rivals for centuries. Trust doesn't develop overnight. Of course not, but framework agreements with built-in verification measures can help build that trust over time. Vexlar studied the human carefully. You know quite a lot about diplomatic strategies for someone who's just an observer. Parker's expression remained neutral. Earth may be new to the galactic stage, Commander, but we've had plenty of practice with complex negotiations on our own planet. After dismissing Parker, Vexlar couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this human than met the eye. She was too knowledgeable, too confident. And yet, what harm could one unarmed human possibly do on a warship full of Krellal warriors? The next day, as negotiations continued, something strange began to happen. The Salarian delegates started referencing obscure Krellal cultural concepts in their proposals, concepts that even Vexlar had to search his memory to recall. As the ancient Krellal philosopher Val once said, honor is found not in victory but in balanced exchange, Counselor Reth quoted, his skin glowing a respectful blue-green. We believe our proposal honors this principle. Vexlar was so surprised by the accurate quote from Krellal philosophy that he momentarily lost track of the conversation. How did the Salarians know about Val? His teachings weren't widely shared outside Krellal society. Throughout the day, similar moments occurred. The Salarians demonstrated an uncanny understanding of Krellal cultural values, historical precedents, and even obscure legal traditions. Each time they used this knowledge not to antagonize but to frame their proposals in terms that resonated with Krellal sensibilities. And each time, Vexlar found himself glancing at the human observer, who continued to take notes as if everything was proceeding normally. During a break, Vexlar pulled Lieutenant Craw aside. The human, has she had any contact with the Salarian delegation outside the negotiation room? Craw shook her head. No, Commander, she's been either in her quarters or the observation deck when not attending negotiations. And what about her access to our information systems? Still just cultural and historical documents, nothing classified or restricted. Vexlar's mandibles clicked rapidly in thought. Something isn't right. The Salarians are suddenly experts on Krellal culture, quoting our philosophers and invoking our traditions. This isn't coincidence. You think the human is involved? Craw asked. I don't know how, but yes. Keep watching her, and I want a full record of every document she's accessed. As the final day of negotiations began, Vexlar was surprised when the Salarian delegation requested that observer Parker be permitted to speak. This is highly irregular, Vexlar objected. The human is here as an observer only. We understand, Counselor Reth replied, his skin pulsing with calm blue light. But we believe she might offer a perspective beneficial to both our peoples as a neutral third party, so to speak. Vexlar glanced at Parker, who appeared as surprised as he was. After a moment's consideration, his curiosity won out. Very well, observer Parker may speak briefly. Parker stood, straightening her simple Earth diplomat's uniform. Thank you, Commander Vexlar, Counselor Reth. I'd like to propose a framework for the disputed territories that draws on both Krellal and Salarian precedents. She activated a holographic display showing a complex but elegant arrangement of territorial boundaries, resource-sharing agreements, and security protocols. This proposal incorporates the Krellal principle of earned territory through survey work, while acknowledging the Salarian tradition of open transit corridors. The central regions would be jointly administered under a council structure similar to the ancient Krellal trade compacts. For the next 20 minutes, Parker outlined a comprehensive agreement that, to Vexlar's astonishment, addressed nearly every point of contention while offering meaningful concessions to both sides. She referenced obscure legal precedents from both cultures and suggested enforcement mechanisms that respected the honor codes of both species. When she finished, the room was silent. Finally, Counselor Reth's skin glowed a bright, approving yellow. The Salarian Union finds this proposal acceptable in principle. We would need to discuss some details, but the framework is sound. All eyes turned to Vexlar. The commander was still trying to process what he'd just witnessed. This observer had just constructed a more sophisticated diplomatic proposal than many of his own negotiators could have managed. And somehow she had gained enough knowledge of Krell culture and law to make it palatable to his people. The hegemony will consider this proposal, he said finally. We will need time to review the specifics, of course. Parker nodded respectfully. I've transmitted full documentation to both delegations. As the session adjourned for deliberations, Vexlar cornered Parker in the corridor. Who are you really? He demanded. No observer could have produced that proposal. Parker looked up at him calmly. I am exactly who I said I am, Commander, a diplomatic observer from Earth. No human could have such deep knowledge of Krell law and culture. Our societies have barely interacted. You gave me access to your cultural database, she pointed out. I spent the last few days studying it thoroughly. In a few days, Vexlar scoffed. Impossible, those texts take our own scholars years to master. Parker smiled enigmatically. Humans can be quick studies when motivated. Before Vexlar could respond, his communicator chimed with an urgent message. What is it? He snapped. Commander, Lieutenant Kraw's voice was tense. We've just received word from Hegemony Command. 3 Salarian battle fleets have been detected moving toward the disputed territory. Vexlar's blood ran cold. So this was all a distraction, he growled, glaring at Parker. While we negotiated, they positioned their forces for an attack. I assure you, Commander, I knew nothing about this, Parker said, her expression grave. We'll see about that, Vexlar snarled. Guards, escort observer Parker to the brig. She's no longer a guest but a prisoner of the hegemony. As the guards escorted Parker away, her face remained frustratingly calm. No protests, no pleas for mercy, just that same calculating look in her eyes that had unsettled Vexlar from the beginning. Commander, Lieutenant Kraw approached, mandibles twitching nervously. What about the negotiations? There will be no more negotiations, Vexlar snapped. Inform the Salarian delegation that we are aware of their fleet movements and consider it an act of aggression. They have 1 hour to explain themselves before we consider it a declaration of war. Kraw hesitated, and the humans. Interrogate her, find out what she knows about the Salarian plans. Vexlar turned to storm toward the bridge. I want to know exactly how deep this deception goes. The bridge of the dominant force buzzed with activity as Vexlar entered. Officers moved between stations with practiced efficiency, preparing the massive warship for potential combat. Status report, Vexlar demanded, taking his place in the command chair. The tactical officer, a seasoned Krell named Draz, brought up a holographic display of the sector. 3 Salarian battle groups approaching from different vectors. Estimated time to weapons range, 4 hours. And our forces. The rest of our fleet is scattered across the sector. The closest battle group is 6 hours away at maximum speed. Vexlar hissed in frustration, so we're outnumbered 3-1. Commander, Dres confirmed, but the dominant force is equivalent to at least 2 of their cruisers in firepower. Mobilize all fighter squadrons, bring weapon systems to full readiness. Vexlar studied the tactical display, mind racing through combat scenarios. And get me a secure channel to Hegemony Command. We need reinforcements immediately. As his crew carried out his orders, Vexlar couldn't help but think about the human observer. What role had she played in this? Was she a spy feeding information to the Salarians, or merely a pawn in their larger game? Either way, he intended to find out. The brig of the dominant force was designed to hold prisoners of various species, with atmospheric controls that could create anything from methane-rich environments to the ammonia soup that some species breathed. Parker had been placed in a standard cell with Earth-normal conditions. When Vexlar entered, she was sitting calmly on the simple cot, looking for all the world like a tourist taking a break during a long day of sightseeing. Commander, she acknowledged with a nod. I presume you're here to interrogate me. You don't seem particularly concerned about your situation, Vexlar observed, remaining just outside the energy barrier that sealed her cell. Parker shrugged. Panic rarely improves difficult situations. You're facing charges of espionage, possibly even war crimes if we determine you played a role in what appears to be an imminent Salarian attack. There's been a misunderstanding, Parker said. I was not aware of any fleet movements. A convenient claim. Vexlar paced in front of her cell. Yet you've spent days accessing our cultural databases, feeding information to the Salarians, helping them gain our trust while their warships moved into position. I did study your cultural documents extensively, Parker admitted, but I shared that information to facilitate understanding, not conflict. Understanding, Vexlar laughed, a harsh chittering sound. The Salarians have never sought understanding with the hegemony, only advantage. And perhaps that's the problem. Parker stood, moving closer to the energy barrier. Both sides have been locked in a cycle of suspicion for so long that you can't recognize an opportunity for genuine progress when it appears. Vexlar bristled. You're in no position to lecture me about interstellar politics, human. Your species has barely left its solar system. True, but sometimes an outside perspective can see what those too close to a situation cannot. Parker's voice remained frustratingly calm. Have you considered why the Salarians would move their fleets now, during negotiations that were progressing favorably? The question caught Vexlar off guard. To attack us while we're distracted, obviously. Or perhaps they received intelligence that worried them. Maybe they believe the hegemony is planning something. Vexlar's mandibles clicked in irritation. We have no plans beyond defending our territorial claims. Are you certain everyone in the hegemony shares that limited objective? Before Vexlar could respond, his communicator chimed. Commander, urgent message from Counselor Reth. Put him through, Vexlar ordered, never taking his eyes off Parker. Reth's voice came through clearly on the speaker. Commander Vexlar, I understand you've detained the Earth Observer and are concerned about our fleet movements. Concerned is an understatement, Counselor. Your actions border on a declaration of war. We have received intelligence that elements within the Krellal military are planning a preemptive strike against Salarian territories, Reth replied, his tone serious. Our fleet movements are purely defensive, sir. Vexlar scoffed. The hegemony has made no such plans. Perhaps not the hegemony leadership, Reth conceded, but we have credible information about a faction within your military that operates with some autonomy. Vexlar froze. Could Reth be referring to Admiral Zex Torn's battle group? The Admiral had been increasingly vocal about taking a more aggressive stance against the Salarians. This is the first I'm hearing of such plans, Vexlar said carefully. We'd be willing to share our intelligence, Reth offered, but first we insist on Observer Parker's immediate release. She has diplomatic immunity under Council law. Vexlar glanced at Parker, who was watching the exchange intently. I'll consider your request, Vexlar out. He terminated the connection. You know something about this, he accused Parker. I know that Admiral Zex Torn has been gathering support for a first strike against Salarian outposts, Parker replied calmly, and that he operates with minimal oversight from Hegemony Central Command. Vexlar's secondary eyelids flickered rapidly, a sign of shock among his species. How could you possibly know that? That information is classified at the highest levels. I didn't, Parker smiled slightly, until you just confirmed it. Vexlar hissed in frustration. He'd been outmaneuvered by this human. Release me, Commander, Parker said, and I can help prevent this situation from escalating into a war that neither side truly wants. Why should I trust you? Because right now, I'm the only neutral party in this equation, and because I spent days studying not just Krellal culture but Krellal psychology. I understand how your honor codes work, Commander. You're bound by duty to the hegemony, but you're also bound by honor to truth. Vexlar studied the human for a long moment. If I release you, what do you propose to do? Arrange a direct meeting between you and Counselor Reth. No aides, no delegations, just the two decision-makers and me as a neutral mediator. And why would that help? Because both of you are being manipulated by factions within your own governments who want war. Direct communication will bypass those influences. Vexlar contemplated this. Could the human be right? Was Admiral Zex Torn acting without proper authorization? Very well, he deactivated the energy barrier. But you'll remain under guard, and if this is some trick. It's not, Parker assured him. War benefits neither the hegemony nor the Union. It would only serve those who profit from conflict. The small conference room felt tense as Vexlar waited. He'd agreed to meet with Counselor Reth alone, with only Parker present as a mediator. It was a risk, but one he'd calculated worth taking. The door slid open and Reth entered, his bioluminescent skin pulsing with cautious blue patterns. He took a seat across from Vexlar. Counselor, Vexlar acknowledged with a formal gesture. Commander, Reth returned the gesture. I appreciate your willingness to meet like this. Parker sat between them. Thank you both for agreeing to this dialogue. I suggest we begin by sharing information openly without diplomatic filters. Very well. Reth activated a small device, projecting intercepted communications between Admiral Zex Torn and several Krell military outposts. These messages, intercepted by our intelligence services 3 days ago, detail plans for a surprise attack on our mining colonies in the Kuiper sector. The attack was scheduled to begin tomorrow. Vexlar examined the communications carefully. They appeared authentic and the tactical details aligned with Zex Torn's known strategies. These operations were not authorized by Hegemony Command, he said finally. If they're genuine, Admiral Zex Torn is acting outside his authority. We suspected as much, Reth nodded, which is why we moved our fleets as a precaution, not as an aggressive act. Vexlar felt a growing unease. I need to contact Command immediately to verify this. Of course, Parker agreed. But first, perhaps Counselor Reth could address your concerns about Salarian intentions in the disputed territories. For the next hour, the two leaders engaged in the most direct and honest conversation they'd had in years of diplomatic interactions. Without the pressure of their full delegations watching, both felt free to acknowledge the complexities of their positions. Reth admitted that certain factions within the Salarian Union were indeed pushing for a more aggressive stance. Vexlar acknowledged that resource competition had led the hegemony to sometimes overlook diplomatic solutions in favor of military posturing. Throughout it all, Parker guided the conversation with subtle questions and occasional clarifications, never imposing her own views, but helping both sides articulate their true concerns. I need to return to my ship and verify this information about Admiral Zex Torn, Reth said eventually. If it's confirmed, we need to coordinate our response carefully. Agreed, Vexlar nodded. Rogue military actions could plunge both our peoples into a war neither of us wants. As Reth stood to leave, he flashed a pattern of respectful acknowledgement toward Parker. Your species continues to surprise us, Observer Parker. I had my doubts when the Council insisted on your presence, but you've proven unexpectedly valuable. After Reth departed, Vexlar turned to Parker. You knew about Zex Torn all along, didn't you? Parker shook her head. I suspected there might be factions on both sides working against peace. It's a common pattern in Earth's history too, but I didn't know the specifics until Reth shared them. Then how did you know to focus on Krell honor codes and cultural traditions in your research? How did you know exactly what to look for in our databases? Parker smiled. I didn't just study your cultural texts, Commander. I studied patterns, diplomatic histories, conflict resolutions, cultural flashpoints. I noticed that whenever Krell and Salarians came close to meaningful agreements, something would derail the process. That suggested interference from parties who benefited from continued tension. Vexlar studied the human with new appreciation. And your proposal yesterday, the one that both sides found surprisingly acceptable. I simply integrated elements that resonated with core values of both cultures. Not the political posturing, but the underlying principles that your peoples actually care about. Before Vexlar could respond, his communicator chirped urgently. Commander, Lieutenant Kraw's voice came through, we're detecting unusual activity from Admiral Zex Torn's battle group. They've changed course and appear to be heading directly toward the Salarian mining outposts. Vexlar's blood ran cold. Estimated time to contact. 3 hours, Commander. Alert Hegemony Command immediately and get me a direct channel to Admiral Zex Torn. Parker's expression grew serious. If Zex Torn attacks those outposts, the Salarians will have no choice but to respond with full force. Both sides will be drawn into war, regardless of what you and Counselor Reth want. I know, Vexlar growled, but my authority doesn't extend to ordering another admiral to stand down. Then perhaps we need someone whose authority would be recognized by both sides, Parker suggested. Someone with the backing of the Galactic Council. Vexlar looked at her skeptically. You're just an observer. Parker's smile turned enigmatic. Am I? The bridge of the dominant force was buzzing with tension as Vexlar and Parker entered. On the main view screen, Admiral Zex Torn's face glowered back at them, his mandibles set in a stubborn pattern. This is absurd, Vexlar, the Admiral was saying. I'm executing a necessary preemptive strike against Salarian forces that have been building up for months. The fact that you've fallen for their diplomatic distractions is disappointing. Your actions have not been sanctioned by Hegemony Command, Vexlar insisted. Stand down your forces immediately. I answer to the High General, not to you, Zex Torn snapped. And my orders come from higher authorities than you can access. Parker stepped forward. Admiral Zex Torn, I am Zara Parker, Special Envoy of the Galactic Council's Peacekeeping Division. Both Krell turned to look at her in surprise. Special Envoy, Vexlar repeated. You said you were an observer. I am an observer, Parker replied calmly. But my full credentials were left intentionally vague to allow me to assess the situation without prejudice. She turned back to the screen. Admiral, I am invoking Council Protocol 7 Alpha, which grants emergency authority to prevent unauthorized military actions that threaten galactic peace. My authentication code is being transmitted to your systems now. Zex Torn's eyes widened as data scrolled across a secondary screen on his bridge. This is impossible. The Council doesn't grant such authority to humans. The Council grants authority to those it deems capable, regardless of species, Parker replied. As of this moment, I am ordering your battle group to stand down and return to hegemony space immediately. Or what? Zex Torn challenged, though his mandibles were clicking uncertainly. Or face the combined response of not only the Salarian Union, but also Council enforcement fleets. The nearest is only 2 hours from your position. Zex Torn's secondary eyelids flickered rapidly. You're bluffing. The Council doesn't have enforcement fleets in this sector. Check your long-range sensors, Admiral, Parker suggested calmly. After a moment, one of Zex Torn's officers leaned in to whisper something in his ear. The Admiral's posture shifted subtly, a sign of shock that Vexlar recognized immediately. Those signatures, they can't be Council ships, Zex Torn protested. The Council hasn't deployed a peace enforcement fleet in over 50 cycles. Times change, Parker replied simply. Your decision, Admiral, stand down or face the consequences of violating direct Council orders. For several tense moments, Zex Torn seemed to be calculating his options. Finally, his mandibles dropped in the Krell gesture of reluctant acquiescence. Very well, we will return to hegemony space, but this isn't over, Special Envoy. The transmission ended abruptly. Vexlar turned to Parker, his forearms crossing in front of him. Special Envoy, Council Protocol 7 Alpha, enforcement fleets. Just how much of that was true? Parker's lips curved into a small smile. The authentication codes were genuine, the rest was adaptive diplomacy. You lied to an admiral of the Krell hegemony. I presented the information he needed to hear to make the right decision, Parker shrugged. Sometimes perception matters more than reality in diplomatic situations. And the Council ships his sensors detected. Probably the Salarian defensive fleet changing position. His sensors would detect energy signatures but not necessarily identify them correctly at that range. Vexlar couldn't decide whether to be outraged or impressed. You took an enormous risk if Zex Torn had called your bluff. I calculated it was a risk worth taking, and I had confidence in my reading of Krell psychology. Your people value hierarchy and proper authority. Once I established credentials he recognized as legitimate, his cultural programming made compliance the path of least resistance. So you manipulated him using our own cultural values against us. Vexlar's voice held a note of grudging admiration. I prevented a war, Parker corrected gently, using whatever tools were available. Vexlar was about to respond when Lieutenant Kra approached urgently. Commander, we're receiving a priority transmission from Hegemony Command. On the view screen appeared the stern face of High General Z Navar, Supreme Commander of all hegemony forces. His exoskeleton bore the elaborate markings of decades of service. Commander Vexlar, the High General began without preamble, we have received disturbing reports of unauthorized military actions by Admiral Zex Torn. We're also receiving urgent communications from the Galactic Council regarding a potential breach of peace protocols. Yes, High General, Vexlar replied, standing at attention. Admiral Zex Torn was attempting to launch strikes against Salarian mining outposts without authorization. The situation has been temporarily contained but remains volatile. I see, the High General's gaze shifted to Parker. And you must be the human observer who has apparently been causing quite a stir. Parker bowed respectfully. Special Envoy Zara Parker at your service, High General. Special Envoy, the General's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Interesting, the Council informed me they were sending an observer with flexible parameters. I didn't realize how flexible they meant. Vexlar looked between them in confusion. You knew about this, High General. Not the specifics, Commander, but the Council has been concerned about escalating tensions in this sector for some time. They requested permission to send someone who could assess the situation independently. The General focused on Parker again. Though I must say, your methods are rather unorthodox, Special Envoy. Desperate times call for creative measures, High General, Parker replied. Admiral Zex Torn has stood down his forces, but I believe this situation requires more permanent resolution. Indeed, Admiral Zex Torn will be recalled immediately for debriefing. The way the General said the word made it clear that Zex Torn's career was effectively over. Commander Vexlar, you are hereby authorized to conclude negotiations with the Salarian delegation as you see fit. The hegemony desires peace, not unnecessary conflict. Thank you, High General, Vexlar replied, surprised by this turn of events. After the transmission ended, Vexlar turned to Parker. You've been playing a much deeper game than you let on. Not a game, Commander, a mission, one that I believe we've successfully completed. And what mission was that exactly? Parker's expression grew serious. To determine whether peace between your peoples is possible or whether outside intervention would be necessary. I'm pleased to report that despite cultural differences and historical tensions, reasonable voices exist on both sides. With the right support, those voices can prevail over those who profit from conflict. Vexlar studied the human with new eyes. This small, seemingly insignificant being had masterfully manipulated both the Krellel and the Salarians, outmaneuvered a warmongering admiral, and potentially averted an interstellar war, all while supposedly being just an observer. You humans are more dangerous than we realized, he said finally. Not dangerous, Parker corrected. Just effective when we need to be. We learned long ago on Earth that sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior firepower but from superior understanding. 3 days later, Vexlar stood in the docking bay, watching as Parker prepared to board her transport vessel. The negotiations had concluded successfully, with both sides agreeing to the framework she had proposed, with minor modifications. I must say, Special Envoy, when you first arrived, I considered your presence an annoyance at best, Vexlar admitted. I never imagined a human could have such impact on Krell-Salarian relations. Parker smiled. Sometimes the most effective diplomat is the one no one expects to matter. Will you tell me the truth now? Were you really sent by the Council with emergency powers, or was that all an elaborate bluff? Let's just say the Council granted me certain flexibilities in how I represented my authority. Parker's eyes twinkled with amusement. Sometimes perception creates its own reality in diplomatic situations. And Admiral Zex Torn, what will happen to him? That's for the hegemony to decide, but I suspect his days of warmongering are over. Vexlar clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. You know, the Galactic Council has been trying to broker peace between our peoples for decades without success, yet you accomplished it in less than a week. How? I didn't come with preconceived notions or historical baggage, Parker explained. I simply observed what was important to each side and found the places where your values aligned rather than conflicted. And manipulated our cultural blind spots, Vexlar added dryly. Parker laughed. I prefer to think of it as helping both sides see past cultural limitations. But yes, understanding psychology is as important as understanding politics in diplomacy. She extended her hand in the human gesture of farewell. After a moment's hesitation, Vexlar took it in his larger chitinous grip. "Will we be seeing more human diplomats in the future?" he asked. "That depends on whether the Council believes we've proven our usefulness." Parker's expression grew more serious. "My mission was as much about proving humanity's value to galactic diplomacy as it was about preventing a war between your peoples. I'd say you've made quite an impression." Vexlar performed the Krellal gesture of respect, touching his forehead and then extending his palm outward. "Safe journey, Special Envoy Parker. I suspect we'll be hearing more about you in the future." As Parker's ship detached from the dominant force and moved away into space, Vexlar remained at the viewport, watching it go. The human had been right about many things, but one observation in particular stayed with him. Sometimes the greatest power came not from weapons or fleets but from understanding. Perhaps that was why the Galactic Council had sent her, not because humans were particularly advanced or powerful, but because they excelled at something both the Krellal and Salarians had forgotten: the art of seeing through another's eyes. As he turned to leave the docking bay, Vexlar made a mental note to study Earth culture more carefully in the future. If one human could accomplish so much, what might others be capable of? The species that everyone had dismissed as primitive newcomers to the galactic stage might well prove to be more significant than anyone had imagined. And that, Vexlar realized, was perhaps the most important diplomatic lesson of all.